My name is Tom Polum, and I'm going to be the director of Phantom here at the Westchester Broadway Theatre. And I thought this time I'd like to learn a little bit more about Phantom, so I went to interview Maury Yeston, the composer. It's great to see you.
Oh, it's great to see you too. I'm so thrilled about this production.
Yeah.
It's great.
Well, you know what, let's start with you a little bit. Did you always want to be a Tony-nominated and winning composer for Broadway?
You know, that's not the way it happened. I mean, my mother played the piano, and when I was about 5 years old, I just went to the piano and I figured it out, and I started playing what she was playing. And so she just drew with a pencil the letters on the keys so I could learn the letters. And I guess I started taking lessons when I was 6, but even as soon as I was 6, I started writing music. I didn't know that you shouldn't. And then I guess I must have been about 11 years old, and they took me to see My Fair Lady with Julie and Rex, and that was it for me. I knew I wanted to write concert music, but I also wanted to write musical theater. And then as I grew older, I became a jazz musician. I think those of us who grew up in the baby boom generation had an incredibly democratic experience of music because they invented the LP. And so all of a sudden, any kind of music that ever was, you could hear finally on a record. And so I just became imbued with all of these styles, and probably still have integrated them into the theatrical world. If you're doing an English show or a French show or an Italian show, that and studying in college and then traveling all over the world, I guess that became my musical self. With two things. One, the influence of my grandfather, who was a cantor in a synagogue, so there's a lot of that. Actually, three things. My father, who was born and raised in London, and so this kind of English music hall. From that, he taught me we used to play ukulele duets and sing English music hall songs like Don't Go Down to the Mines, Dad. And then, because he had his business in Montreal, he immigrated from London to Montreal to New Jersey, of all places. We would, in the 1950s, we would vacation, and he would always take a house north of Montreal and Quebec in French Canada. And so I would hear Chevalier and Piaf coming out of the radio all the time, and people speaking French, and I think I must have thought I was a French kid. And I think in Mélodie de Paris and in Folie Bergère, I think there's a kind of a French aspect to my musical character, you might say. So all of that kind of got mushed together. But yes, I always knew I wanted to write for musical theater.
So you said that you were influenced by lots of different styles.
Lots of different, yeah.
Is there any one particular style that you're really drawn to?
Yeah, well, it started out with Beethoven, interestingly enough. When I was about 8 or 9 years old, my mother gave me the 9 Beethoven symphonies, I think conducted by Bruno Walter, and that just became my Bible. And then very early on, when I was about 10 years old, I wanted to learn what we called at the time popular music. and I changed piano teachers from a classical musician to a guy from Bayonne, New Jersey. We should give him the credit. His actual name was Nat Glad, and he played club dates. And he brought me a fake book, and by the time I was 13 years old, I was playing club dates. I think what's useful about all that is that whatever I happen to be writing, I can write in the vernacular of what that subject matter is, or what that nationality is, or one of the great influence, or I should say my heroes, is Schubert, because he so very much makes the piano a character, and makes the piano able to describe what's going on in the song, and I try to do that too. I try to tell the story in music. I think that's probably the most characteristic thing about me. I was influenced by all the great tone poems too, like Don Quixote by Richard Strauss. Strauss once said that he could make you see knives and forks dancing on the table with music, and I believe that too. And I think that's what I love about it. Learning how to draw descriptive strength from music, so that even that part of it that isn't words is still telling you a story.
So if you're going to just listen to music for entertainment, what's your preferred choice of music?
Oh, everything. The latest hip thing that's going on, to early music from Leonine and Peretin of the 12th century.
What do you think of rap?
I love rap. I'm crazy for rap. Yeah, well, actually, when I was because of my background in jazz and African American music and folk music, I studied it at Yale, and actually studied West African music with Robert Farris Thompson, who actually lived in West Africa. And so when I got back from 2 years at Cambridge in England, and the Vietnam War was on, I got a fellowship to teach at a black college, Lincoln University. And since they did not have an Afro-Am program, and I did know the history of jazz and African American music, I founded that course at Lincoln. And then when I went to do my PhD at Yale, I taught that course at Yale. You know, if you look at the history of Broadway music, it's ethnic composers, many Jewish composers who were completely obsessed with African American music, from Gershwin to Berlin, and I am too, you know. And so rap is just the latest iteration of what started as early jazz and Louis Armstrong and what became bebop and swing, and it'll never stop.
Let's turn to Phantom.
Okay.
Well, how did you get started and get involved with Phantom?
Well, you know, it's interesting. Most of what I write or what I've written is sort of author initiated. I have an idea for Nine or whatever. But in this case, Arthur Copeland and I had put Nine, the musical, on Broadway, and we got a call from Jeffrey Holder, the wonderful director. Timbuktu was one of his great pieces on Broadway, and he said, "Look, I have the rights to this book by Gaston Leroux called Phantom of the Opera," and I'd never read the book, but I certainly had seen 3 or 4 different movies by that title over the years. So, he said, I'd like you guys, I love your work, and I'd like you to consider writing a musical based on it. And my first reaction was, it's a terrible idea. I mean, it's a horror movie. You know, Claude Rains he's disfigured because somebody threw acid in his face, and he jumps in the Seine to wash it up. And I said, you know, what are we going to do? Mothra meets Godzilla, the musical? And he said, well, you know what, read the book. And let's have a meeting after you read the book. So I did read the book. It's a deeply romantic story that takes place in the 19th century. And when we came back, I said, you know, I think that this is an age when if you had a mad sister, you'd lock her up in the attic. And if you have somebody, if he's disfigured from birth, then they'd hide him in the crypt below the opera. Maybe his mother is a singer, or even if she isn't, that's what he's raised on. He hears, so he, as horrible, misshapen as he is on the outside, that's the beauty of him in the inside, and it's the beauty of music and of the great composers, you know, whether it's Wagner or Verdi or Mozart. And so somebody who is outwardly imperfect and inwardly illuminated with beauty, that's Quasimodo.
Yeah.
That's the Elephant Man. And there's something universal about that, because who among us doesn't understand in a way that despite our outward imperfections, inside, we're better, we mean well. And so I think there's something compelling and universal about it. In fact, you know, now that I remember it, I think I saw the Elephant Man with David Bowie. And I will never forget how David Bowie did it on Broadway. He, as somebody was describing the horrible tumors and awful misshapen things about him physically, Bowie was in a bright light, wearing nothing but a loincloth, and you know, with that pale, absolutely naked, terrifyingly pristine body and skin that he had, and that tension and dissonance between the description of him as being so hideous and the beauty of David Bowie in the flower of his youth, wearing hardly anything. I think that transfixing image was the one that made me realize that that's my guy, that's my Phantom. And from there on in, we began to put together a story.
So really that idea doesn't exist in any of the other treatments, really, of Phantom. No. This is sort of what makes it work as a musical for you.
Right. I'll tell you a funny story. Peter Stone, the wonderful author of 1776, we wrote Titanic together. He said to me once, "Yeston, how long are you going to live?" And I said, "What a terrible question." He said, no, we all don't live forever. And I said, can I be generous? And he said, yes. And I said, okay, I have the number. He said, right, divide by 6, that's the number of musicals you can write. But they do take years and years and years. And so for me, if I'm going to commit myself to a show in that amount of time in my life, I have to answer several questions. The first is, why am I in this theater? Why do I care about this? What does this mean to me? And then, what about what I'm watching means something to me personally in my life? And if I can answer that question, then I know that at least it's worth it for me to be in the theater to watch it, and maybe somebody else will find something in it for themselves as well. And for this, that was the universal notion that I had had. And I realized, well, then if he lives, the only thing that makes it possible for him to live, then he's living in a horrible crypt. So what he would do is, if he's in the opera house, he'd steal the most beautiful scenery in the world and bring it downstairs. So he would have the bed from Lohengrin, and he would have the forest from Pelias and Melisande, and so he'd have this wonderful environment. Despite his face and the mask he has in front of it, the glorious soprano voices and music wafting down through the crypts into his heart are like mother's milk to him. So all you have to do to create a story, to give him a problem, is take that away, and then he has nothing but darkness. And so I figured, all right, well, fine. So the person who runs the opera house is replaced by an awful woman with a terrible voice.
Yeah, it's a perfect example of what's different about this day.
Right.
His world's
and now he has to find a voice. He has to find some beauty in it. And what I know about Arthur Kopit is that he finds ways of putting humor in this tragic story. I mean, there's the one moment in the show when he's down in the crypt and he hears the new woman vocalizing. He says to his uncle, "The place really is haunted."
And it always gets a laugh.
It always gets
and
a laugh.
It breaks that tension.
That's
just
right.
Enough
That's right.
So that it pulls the audience in.
He's a guy. He's got a sense of humor. And also that the only danger to him is that if somebody sees him, and so there always has to be something that starts a story. What happened? And what happened was, first off, what happened was that they've replaced the beautiful voice with a not beautiful voice, but worse, somebody has seen him. And he's not a murderer, but he had to kill him because otherwise he can't survive. And that's the first time he's killed. And it's a huge problem for him. But now everybody's looking for him. And of course, he's always made them think that there's a ghost down there, so they would stay away. And so now he's got a problem. And also, when he finally does see this girl and fall in love with her, I think it's Steven Spielberg who once said, "Well, it's a love story. What's the what's the obstacle?" And in this case, the obstacle is very obvious, and so that's the obstacle that they have to overcome.
So tell us a little bit about the writing process. What came first, the songs, the book? Did they come at the same
First
time?
of all, this story that I'm just telling you, the outlines of that story. So the only way that a musical is going to happen is that Frank Lesser once said, "This is the music business, and nothing in the music business happens without music." And it's a musical. And so it's my job as the composer to answer the question, how does this sing? Where does it sing? Where are those moments when we have to burst into song because we're so moved with emotion we can no longer speak? I'll quote Frank Lesser again. He said very famously, songs happen in musicals where exclamations happen in language. Some songs begin with an exclamation. "Oh, what a beautiful morning." And so I start to find those places in the story. And so, for example, one of the first things I found was the notion that once he no longer has a beautiful voice that sustains him, he has to find one. And I got the idea for Where in the World. Find me another voice. And once I had put together, I think probably 3 or 4 or 5 songs together with the beginning of an outline of a story, I had enough to start a conversation with Arthur. And then 2 or 3 people, they sit together and you literally talk a show into existence. You say, "Hey, what about this? What about that?" I remember in the musical Titanic, I thought to myself, well, what if the stoker is afraid that his girlfriend won't wait for him before he gets back, if he may marry somebody else? So he goes up in the middle of the night and gets the radio operator to propose to the girl. And suddenly there's a song that never existed in the story of the ship, but suddenly it's there. And that especially kept happening in Phantom. Songs that weren't necessarily begun by the story, but became the story. I think I've learned, having written a lot of shows now, I find that the secret to writing musicals is that you're always fixing them. You're always fixing them, and you never really finish.
Yeah, I always say musicals are never finished, they're just produced.
That's right. Well, I think Robbins said they're never finished, they're abandoned for lack of time. And you sort of never stop. You know, even now, there are foreign productions in which there are cultural differences in which I'm able to make an adjustment in the show. And I mean, I've always said, you know, it's great to be a living author because you can do that. I constantly find folks like you, who are very creative, show me things in the show that I never even thought were there. So I keep learning.
How did you go about getting the first production of that?
I wrote it fairly quickly, and so did Arthur, and Jeffrey was very enthusiastic about it. But what he didn't know was that he only had the rights to that book for a short period of time because it went into the public domain. So all of a sudden, anybody could do Phantom of the Opera. Well, fine. We had our score by then, and in fact, we were doing backers auditions. I remember flying with Arthur and Jeffrey to Santa Fe, and there was a bunch of investors there, and I remember playing the score for them. And we had a set designer who had started to do some drawings, and then. And by the way, I find it's true in so many subject matters. You know, how many Cinderellas are there? How many Beauties and the Beasts are there? And in this case, there was a Ken Hill production in England. Andrew Lloyd Webber had seen that. He was fascinated with the story, and he announced that he wanted to write Phantom of the Opera. Same thing happened to me when I started writing Titanic, and all of a sudden, here's this movie that comes along. We opened first there. But in any case, as soon as the word came that Andrew was interested in writing Phantom, because of, you know, the nature of the business, and it is show and business, it's two words. There were a lot of people in New York, and I don't blame them, who thought, well, how are we going to compete with a juggernaut like Andrew, who has had so many wonderful successes, and so, you know, the bottom dropped out. So that had happened to me before, and it happened to me after, and that's part of what we go through as creative people. My take on that is that no matter what I write, when I started writing Nine the Musical, I didn't have the rights to Fellini's 8½, and I never thought it was going to be produced. But I wrote it because it kept my pencil sharp, and you learn how to write by writing, and you have to write from where you get your best ideas that you love. So I thought, all right, fine, I've got a French story, because it was my intention to write something operatic because we were in the opera. Write something French because we're in Paris in the 19th century, and I loved Gigi. So now I've got the basis of a French 19th century score, and maybe one day there'll be another French 19th century story that I'll have, and I'll have some French operatic music in my trunk, and, you know, moving right along. And and soon after that, Placido Domingo asked me to write Goya for him, and suddenly I was writing a song about a Spanish painter. And that was it. The Lloyd Webber brilliant show, of course, had great success, the most successful show ever, actually. We knew that we didn't have a show. And what you do in a case like that is you shake hands and you write a piece of paper that says, all right, you take the story, I'll take the score, and, you know, maybe you can do something with the story, I'll do something with the score. Because, you know, the truth is that when you're sitting together as a group of people and you're writing a show together, everybody has a name. That's the composer, that's the lyricist, that's the book writer. And once we know that, and we make an agreement, then anybody who gets anything from any other department, they own it. Right. Otherwise, everybody's going, I did that. So you can't. So I said, Arthur, you know, we wrote the book together. You gave me great ideas for the score. You take the book, I'll take the score. And after the Lloyd Webber was successful on Broadway, Arthur, who's a wonderful writer, actually was asked to write a miniseries for, I think it was HBO, and he did, and it was our story. I would say before that, a number of people had heard my score, one of whom was a guy named Andrew Kurovich, who's a critic, and he wrote an article for Connoisseur magazine called The American Masterpiece That Will Never Be Heard, and something very nice about my score. And Frank Young, who ran Theater Under the Stars in Houston, read that and had heard about it through Jeffrey, and so he said, I want to hear the score. And so right here in New York City, he came, I was there with Arthur, and I played him the score. And I would say in the old days, the composer sat down and played the songs, and he said, "It's wonderful." He says, "I want to do it. I want to do it at Theater Under the Stars." And I said, "Absolutely not. I have no interest in chasing, very estimable Andrew Lloyd Webber down the street. It's his show. I can write my own shows. And besides which, people are going to come to the show thinking they're going to see that. They're going to be disappointed. You can't do that to an audience." And he said, "No." He said, "Really?" He said, I will spend $1 million on this show. I really believe in it." He said, "And I promise you, in all of our advertising, all of our press, and especially when we answer the phone, we will say, we will make sure people understand this caveat. This is not the Andrew Lloyd Webber Phantom of the Opera. This is a separate, independent American musical theater piece that was actually begun before the Lloyd Webber even appeared." And I said, "Well, if you do that, and you're honest about it, and you don't fool people, I'd love to see my work on stage." And so we got to work and found a wonderful Charles Abbott to direct it, and we went to Houston. And he did give us a spectacular, with wonderful cast and a wonderful set, a spectacular production of this show. And shockingly, even at the first performance, there we were in Texas, and granite-hearted cowboys in Texas took out their bandanas or whatever they had and were just dabbing their eyes, and everybody was crying. And I thought, well, if you touch people like that, it's really worth doing. And it turns out that we had really written a show about fathers and sons, and really written a show about love, requited love, about beauty and ugliness, about yearning. Alan J. Lerner wrote in his autobiography, what moves him most is unrequited yearning, and for me that's what this show is. We ache for these characters. We ache for the girl because she wants to love him. She wants to see his face, and so that was a great, exciting moment, And I figured, well, there we are. It's a curiosity, but. We were given an opportunity several months later to go to Seattle at the Fifth Avenue Theater and put the show on again. And at that point, we got to work on it and really hone it and refine it. And it then became available for licensing for theaters all over the country. And one of the classic productions soon after that was Westchester Broadway Theatre. And they had the same experience, and their audience loved it. They just kept running it.
Yeah, it ended up running 9 months, actually.
9 months, and they've done it often since then. And the critics took it to their hearts. The reviews that we've gotten for it have been absolutely wonderful.
The show always gets reviewed remarkably well.
All over the country.
And it's interesting because it's developed its own brand.
That one of the people who really revolutionized Broadway productions, Cameron McIntosh, because he gets an image like the helicopter in Miss Saigon, and so that's on the marquee, and that's on the playbill, and then he puts that on the cast album, and then you sell the music, and so he put that on the musical booklet, and then he puts it in his advertisement. So I thought, oh well, we can do that. So I went to a wonderful logo artist. His name is Frank Ferluzzo. Nickname is Fravor. He's very well known for several things. One, he did The Lion King, which is extraordinary. He also did the famous Sunday in the Park with George logo, in which they're dressed in the 19th century from the waist up, and they're wearing jeans from the waist down. Yeah. And I said, can you create an image very, very different from the one on Broadway that would be our show? And he did. And he had this idea of the masked phantom being a candelabra, and there's a candle, and the flame, because Christine is light and passion, the flame looks like Christine. And there's red candle wax coming down, and one drop of candle wax is touched and becomes a tear on the phantom's cheek. And the font is a sort of a Germanic, heavy Gothic font. And I said, well, this is beautiful. And so we made sure that that would be available to any theater that wanted to present the show. And when we published the music, it's on the cover of the music. Then we realized that Broadway cast albums are enormously expensive. You have to pay everybody, I think, 2 or 3 weeks of their Broadway salary just to do a Broadway cast album. But my show wasn't a Broadway show. And so you could pay actors scale. And because there was a production of Phantom right at Westchester Broadway Theatre then, and it cost very, very little to do the cast album, and then we put the logo on the cast album. And suddenly we had a logo, a brand, the Phantom logo. It was in everybody's ads all over the country. It was on the cast album from BMG. It was on the vocal book, and that brand went all over the world.
Yeah, I think, do you know how many productions of Phantom there were?
Sam French took out an ad congratulating us for 1,000 productions.
Wow.
I'm sure there've been more than that by now. I mean, well, here's the other thing. And this is not only Phantom, it's happened with Nine the Musical, with Titanic. I mean, Nine was 36 years ago. Phantom was 1991. It's now 2018. And it gets produced more now than it did in the 90s. It's about to open in Japan in 2 different productions. And it's just been a hit in Korea. I'm pressed often to explain how is it possible that some shows have that longevity, and I think the answer is probably the very earliest influence on me, which is classical music. Because classical music never gets old-fashioned, because it has a rigidity and a structure and a grammar to it. You can always listen to Bach or Mozart, and I think because my influence is structured that way, there's a huge difference between old-fashioned and timeless. And I think there are musical elements of it, of the style, that are timeless, so that it's just as hopefully relevant musically as now as it was in 1991.
What really makes the show sing and work well?
It's Beauty and the Beast. At the end of the day, that's the story.
Yeah.
Beauty and the Beast. Beauty, Beast loves beauty. One of the great universal stories of all time. And if you don't ruin it, it can work. And I think that every iteration of it has to be so specific. And the fact, for me, that it's a myth, because any myth in any society has to find a way of reconciling absolute opposite conceptions in a culture that are held at the same time. I felt that way about Titanic. On the one hand, we believe that from the Renaissance, man is at the center of the universe, the master of all things, right? Man can do anything, and at the same time, so we still believe that. We have that Renaissance view of humankind, but we also have not 21st century of humankind, in which we're on a speck of dust, on a remote, nothing galaxy, and one wave of the solar wind, and we're gone. And we hope, and so the Titanic was the apex of human accomplishment, and yet one wave in the irrational universe, and so we tell that story over and over again. And in the case of Phantom, it's precisely this reconciling of what's worst and hideous within us, or can be, and the saving grace of our capacity for love and beauty and kindness, and taming what's wild in us and becoming civilized. And I think we all have that within us.
Maury, it's a remarkable show, and I'm thrilled to be able to be directing it again.
Oh my God, I'm so happy that you are. I cannot wait to see it. And I know you have a great cast.
My last question for you is,
sure,
do you ever think that this Phantom will find its way to Broadway?
Never. Oh, I would never allow it.
Because you just feel it's
we
its own
think
thing.
It's the greatest hit never to play Broadway. One of the great things I've learned is that we've become a non-Broadway centric world. It used to be, when I was growing up, Broadway was where all the new things are. Regional theaters would be doing, copies of what had been on Broadway. Now, Broadway is doing revival after revival after revival, or I guess jukebox musical, which is pre-existent stuff, right? And the real action is happening out in the regions where they're doing where the new exciting things are being done, like Phantom, which was created in the region. So no, I don't see there's any point in going to Broadway.
It doesn't need to.
No, I want to write I want to write new shows for Broadway. Yeah.
Well, Maury, thank you very
Oh,
much.
no,
for your
thank
time.
you very much. I love speaking.
I look forward to seeing you on
I
opening
can't
night.
wait to see the show up at Westchester Broadway. It's just very exciting to me.